Ford and General Motors aren't just facing challenges. They're standing on the edge of a financial crisis that could shake their very foundations. Usually, their CEOs project confidence, but now they're in full damage control mode, scrambling to contain what might be the biggest disruption to the US auto industry in decades, possibly since the oil crisis of the 1970s. The cause? Tariffs, but not just any tariffs. Donald Trump is threatening to impose up to 100% tariffs on vehicles and parts from Mexico and Canada. This move could cripple the supply chains that have kept the industry running for years. Ford CEO Jim Farley isn't holding back, calling the situation chaos and warning that it could devastate the American auto industry, leading to bankruptcies, job losses, and severe economic damage. The financial toll? Billions in loss, revenue, skyrocketing costs, and a blow to competitiveness. The result? A complete shakeup of winners and losers in the auto world. But this isn't just a business story. It's a warning about how fragile global trade is, how unpredictable political decisions can be, and how even the biggest industries can be thrown into turmoil. Despite their deep American roots, Ford and GM manufacture a huge chunk of their vehicles and source many parts from Mexico and Canada, simply because it's far cheaper than doing so in the US. Ford, for example, builds key models like the Bronco, Sport, and the popular Maverick pickup truck in Mexico, taking advantage of lower labor costs, looser regulations, and a trade-friendly environment. GM operates a vast network of factories in both Canada and Mexico, producing millions of vehicles. For the US market, from compact cars to full-size trucks, even cars proudly labeled "Made in the USA" are deeply dependent on foreign components. Most of their engines, transmissions, electronics, and other crucial parts come from abroad. This intricate global supply chain has become the backbone of the modern auto industry, helping companies cut costs and boost profits. Now, imagine the economic fallout if a 25% tariff were slapped on every vehicle and component from these regions. Or worse, a 100% tariff on Canadian vehicles, effectively shutting down cross-border trade. Overnight, the price of every car Ford and GM sell would skyrocket. That leaves them with two painful choices. One option is to pass the massive costs onto consumers, raising car prices across the board. But in a fiercely competitive market, buyers won't be eager to pay thousands more, especially when foreign automakers are offering similar vehicles at much lower prices. The second option is to absorb the tariff costs, which would severely cut into already slim profit margins. Some lower-margin models could become completely unprofitable, forcing Ford and GM to consider shutting down plants, laying off workers, or even discontinuing popular vehicles. Meanwhile, foreign automakers like Toyota, Hyundai, Nissan, and BMW, who have more diversified global supply chains and rely more on domestic production, wouldn't feel the impact nearly as much. The very global network that US automakers rely on could turn into a major disadvantage, allowing competitors to gain ground. And while Ford and GM are trying to project confidence and discuss strategies to soften the blow, Donald Trump, with his signature disregard for diplomacy and appetite for disruption, has made it clear that he plans to impose a 25% tariff on all cars and auto parts from Mexico and Canada. But in a shocking escalation, he's now threatening an even more extreme measure, a staggering 100% tariff on Canadian vehicles. The USMCA trade agreement, which replaced the heavily criticized NAFTA, was carefully crafted to keep auto production running smoothly across North America. While not perfect, it provided a stable and predictable trade framework, allowing automakers to make long-term investments and streamline operations. Initially, Trump delayed implementing the tariffs for a month, supposedly in exchange for stronger border security measures from Mexico. But if these 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian auto imports become permanent, they could create an economic black hole in the US auto industry, like nothing seen before. This isn't just about tariffs. It's about total uncertainty in the industry. And as any economist will tell you, uncertainty is a financial killer, stifling innovation, discouraging investment, and ultimately leading to stagnation. Ford and GM recognize the existential threat and are using their vast resources and political influence to push back, working feverishly behind the scenes to minimize the fallout. But the question remains, will their efforts be enough to prevent disaster? GM, clearly feeling the pressure, is reportedly stockpiling vehicles, rushing to get as many cars and trucks into the US as possible before the tariffs hit. Meanwhile, Ford CEO Jim Farley has made two high-profile trips to Washington in the past 3 weeks, engaging in intense lobbying to persuade policymakers to back down. These are high-stakes meetings where the future of the American auto industry hangs in the balance. Both Ford and GM are exploring the possibility of moving production back to the US, but shifting manufacturing isn't quick, easy, or cheap. It takes years to plan, build, and equip new facilities. GM CEO Mary Barra has cautiously stated that they have a strategy to offset up to 50% of the impact, but the lack of transparency is making Wall Street nervous, sending stock prices tumbling. And while all attention is on potential auto tariffs, another silent threat is lurking: Trump's new steel and aluminum tariffs. These measures, aimed at protecting domestic industries, are having a devastating ripple effect throughout the supply chain. Ford, for example, proudly states that 90% of its steel is sourced from the US, but that remaining 10%, which must be imported, is where costs start piling up, adding millions to annual expenses. While current contracts may keep prices stable, in the short term, future deals will reflect the increased cost of steel and aluminum, making this a ticking time bomb for automakers. The result? Car prices rise, profits shrink, and investors panic. These steel and aluminum tariffs, seemingly minor on their own, act as a slow poison, further weakening the competitiveness of the American auto industry. If Trump's tariffs are enacted, creating an economic nightmare scenario, some companies will be crushed, their businesses ruined. Ford and GM would face skyrocketing costs, dwindling profits, and shrinking market share, locked in a brutal fight for survival in an increasingly hostile and competitive landscape. American consumers, get ready for significantly higher car prices. Auto suppliers, brace for rising steel and aluminum costs. Foreign automakers, Toyota, Honda, BMW, Hyundai, Kia, will be unaffected by US tariffs, allowing them to sell their cars at lower prices while Ford and GM struggle. Potential US factory workers, if, against all odds, production moves back to the US, some jobs may be created, giving local economies a temporary boost. But with automation dominating modern manufacturing, the promised surge in employment may never fully materialize. Meanwhile, as American automakers fight to survive, Chinese electric vehicle companies, backed by government subsidies and cutting-edge technology, could seize the opportunity to gain a strong foothold in the US market. Trump's pitch sounds simple: bring auto jobs back to America and protect American workers. But the reality is far more complicated. Factory relocations take years and require billions in investment, and even when plants are built, robots will take many of the jobs, meaning the employment boom may never happen as promised. And there's an even greater risk: retaliation. Other countries will respond with their own tariffs, triggering a trade war that could spiral out of control, potentially leading to a global recession. The biggest danger of all: the once dominant American auto industry, once the envy of the world, could lose its competitive edge, becoming isolated, inefficient, and unable to compete in the global marketplace. By erecting trade barriers and stifling innovation, these tariffs could ultimately leave the American auto industry weaker and more vulnerable than ever. Ford and GM, the proud standard-bearers of American car manufacturing, are facing the biggest disruption in modern history, an existential crisis that could reshape not just their businesses, but the entire automotive landscape. If Trump moves forward with these tariffs, we're not just talking about slightly higher car prices. We're looking at a massive shakeup of the global auto industry, a seismic shift with major consequences for consumers, workers, and investors alike. Consumers will inevitably pay more for their cars, trucks, and SUVs, reducing their purchasing power and potentially forcing them to delay or even skip buying new vehicles. Jobs might, in theory, shift back to the US, but they won't magically appear overnight. And with automation replacing many manufacturing roles, the promised wave of employment may never fully materialize. Meanwhile, foreign automakers, who won't be hit by these tariffs, stand to gain the most, strengthening their hold on the American market and grabbing even more market share. The American auto industry, for better or worse, relies on complex global supply chains, intricate networks of suppliers and manufacturers that stretch across the world. Disrupting those carefully built relationships overnight is a financial gamble with enormous stakes, a reckless move that could deal a serious blow to the American economy. And while Ford and GM are caught up in a fight for survival, companies like Tesla, BYD, and other fast-growing electric vehicle makers are surging ahead, positioning themselves to dominate the future of mobility. So the big question remains, will these tariffs actually happen? Can Ford and GM survive this unprecedented crisis? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a massive transformation in the US auto industry? One where the old giants give way to a new generation of innovative, tech-driven companies. What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time, because this story is far from over.